I'm Jennifer Poindexter, Director of Promotion and Education Programs at Missouri Farm Bureau. Today we are exploring a log cabin. We're actually at Missouri Farm Bureau headquarters and exploring the log cabin here in Jeff City that once belonged to the Wallendorf family. Let's go check it out. Now we're here with Emily Brune, a former Missouri Farm Bureau intern and log home tour guide. Emily, thanks for joining us and giving a tour of this wonderful log home.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here.
Can you give us some history of the Wallendorf log home that we're in right now?
Yeah, so we're actually standing in the Wallendorf Log Cabin home. It was built in 1839 and was originally built about 7 miles from where the Capitol stands today. So it was continued to be updated and modernized all the way until 1981, which was when the last family member passed away. In 2005, the city was actually going to tear down the Wallendorf Log Cabin, and so Farm Bureau stepped in and purchased the log cabin. Now they took apart the cabin piece by piece and moved it to where it sits now. It was rebuilt using all the same materials, so everything here is original except for a concrete foundation that was poured. And that's only just to maintain the house and make sure it stays stable over the next years.
So when this log home was built in 1839, there was probably no indoor plumbing, there was no lights, because they didn't just have those types of luxuries back then. But what did they really soak in about this home in the 1800s?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what we're standing in is actually called a dog trot home. So the middle part of this would have been completely open at the time. And so this allowed airflow to move through the home and cool the rooms on either side. So as I mentioned, once that home was modernized and updated, they closed in this part. And that would have been around the time that they got air conditioning and lighting and plumbing. So there was a lot of innovative parts about this log cabin home. There's a giant fireplace, and that was used to heat the home during the winter months. Again, everything is original on that. It's very beautiful.
Okay, so now we're standing in the kitchen of the Wallendorf home, and we see all these different utensils that, you know, we have similar ones at our homes. Can you kind of walk us through the period of time that they would have used this kitchen and what was relevant?
Yeah, so as mentioned, this home was built in early mid-1800s. So a lot of the stuff you see here today probably isn't what you have at home. So behind us is a wood stove. This is what they would have cooked on. It's not going to look like what you have in your kitchen. It's not a gas stove or an electric stove. So this is relevant to the time period, though it's not an original piece, as is a lot of stuff within the kitchen. So the kitchen is actually an area that the family spent most of their time in. The stove put off quite a bit of heat, and it was also just a gathering place. People were always cooking food. You know, the women were typically indoors during that time while the men were outside working. So if you look at the table, there's a wide array of tools and kitchen utensils. You know, you might have one mixer or a tool or utensil that can do everything that on this table would be used for. So the time period has really changed. We've really updated our system and what we have. So it looks a little different, but this is what it would have looked like for someone who lived back in the 1800s.
So the stove, you said it's wood, so they would have actually had to cut wood outside, bring it indoors, start a fire in this stove before they ever wanted to start it. So it wasn't a turn your switch and your burner's hot. It was quite the process.
Yes, absolutely. You can imagine how long that would have taken to chop the wood, make sure it's dry, you know, bring it in. If you can warm up a bowl of water in the microwave in 15 seconds? That is not the case here. It would have taken a while to get the fire hot enough to even boil a pot of water on the stove. So the time period spent cooking in here is much longer than what it typically is in our kitchens now.
It's really interesting. So like, I'm kind of looking at these tools. I have one of these at home. And right now it's getting pretty close to Christmas time here in Missouri, and so a lot of us are baking and doing things. But even our rolling pins are a little different, where I can tell this is a rolling pin, but mine looks different. It's ceramic. So even some things that we have now were derived from the tools that they had back in the 1800s, which is a really neat thing. As far as Missouri history goes, when we kind of look back at the history of Missouri and people settling and they built these log homes, was it a team effort to get a log home like this put up, or was it one family built it?
I think that depends on the size of the home. You know, this is actually a fairly large home for that time period. And you kind of mentioned a lot of families would travel across the country to get where they're going. And something like this wood stove isn't something they took with them. This is something they had to get when they got where they were. So I think it depends on the size of the family. A lot of families were pretty large back then. So if you had a family of 11 or 12 and, you know, grown men, they could probably put together a log cabin by themselves. If you had close neighbors, I know they would help each other out. But it really depends on the ultimate size.
And so we're in the kitchen, so I'm thinking food supply. In the 1800s, there wasn't grocery stores or Walmarts that they just ran and picked up a box of macaroni and cheese. Can you kind of talk us through the food supply and what they had to have there on their land?
Yeah, so just about everything the family cooked, they either grew or raised. People had large gardens back then. I know a lot of people have started doing gardens this year because it's been a very different year, but this is what the families relied on. They may have had a couple cattle, hogs, chickens, but whatever they raised and grew is what they depended on. And a lot of people would preserve the food that they grew too. So right now we're in the middle of winter, you know, carrots aren't in season, you know, or potatoes aren't around right now. So they would have to preserve those so that they were able to eat them throughout the winter months.
And we're sitting in the kitchen and I'm looking around, I don't see any refrigerator. So they obviously had to keep things safe to eat in other ways, such as curing meat, smoking meat, and things like that.
Yeah, and a lot of families too, sometimes they would have underground what they would consider like a fridge. They would use ice to keep the food cool. Underground is always a little bit cooler than above the ground, so that was one way to keep
cellar.
Yes. It was one way to keep things cooler, but it's nothing like what we have today.
Now we are in the parlor, which would also be probably compared to like a family room, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And behind us we have a beautiful fireplace. And this draws my eye just because fireplaces kind of are the heart of the home, and that could be where families really gather around, especially in the winter months. But I'm noticing that this is stone and the rest of the house is made out of wood. Why would this be made out of stone?
Yeah, so going back, so this is a gorgeous fireplace. It's all original to the original home. And if you look at the overall size of it, this is a lot bigger than what a fireplace you might have in your house. Typically fireplaces in our homes today are more so for decoration, maybe for a little heat. But something like this was relied to heat the entire house. This is the only heat source they have. So as you mentioned, it is made of stone. Fire will burn wood. And that can be a big problem in a log cabin like what we're in. So if you actually look above, that kind of black piece of wood up there is actually where a fire had started in the home. So we were able to save part of that log, to show that fires do happen, and it kind of was dangerous, but this is how they lived. So the stone was a lot safer compared to the wood material. If you look at the wood material, you can kind of see a difference. There's a white part in between. So log cabins were chinked together. So chinking is kind of what kept the logs together. It also was like an insulation. It's kind of like a cement that will hold them together and try to keep the house a little bit warmer. Typically it was made with some sand in there to really hold them together.
And so this mantle is original too, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
It's beautiful. And you said that fires, you know, can happen, and I'm sure that fires were very common, 1800s, early 1900s, because houses are made out of wood, and our floors are made out of wood and the walls, and so they probably didn't have chimney sweeps or companies that would come out and clean chimneys. So I'm sure that was really important, just to make sure that everything worked properly the way that they needed to, because if they lost this home, they were truly displaced. There wasn't a Salvation Army or people coming in to help them. They were really relying on their neighbors and their community to help them out in that type of situation.
Yeah, it was kind of like a every man for themselves mentality. I mean, you were responsible for your own safety, your own house, livestock, crops. We didn't have the support and the help that we do now. So it was really essential that they take care of what they have and try to be as safe as they possibly could with whatever they were working with.
You mentioned they were responsible for their crops, and in front of me I kind of see that we have some crops here. Can you talk us through what we have here and what this is?
Yeah, so we actually have a whole bunch of crops here, and this is just some of what they would have grown across the nation. So we have soybeans, wheat, corn. Those are a lot of the crops that you still see today. We have barley, cotton, alfalfa, hops. A lot of these are still what we're using today, but they did not produce it at nearly a large scale as what we're doing today. You know, we have tractors and combines and the newest equipment, and that's not what they had. So they had to make do with what they had, and a lot of times that meant they were smaller. They didn't get nearly as much profit or amount from them, but we still have the same crops around that are today.
And so they were really growing these for their own personal consumption. They weren't trying to sell it, or if they were selling it, it wasn't in large quantities. Something I wanted to point out is peanuts that we see here, which is so a lot of people don't think about peanuts being grown here in Missouri, but it is a crop that we grow. And then also tobacco, cotton, sorghum, oats. So it's, really Missouri agriculture is so diverse, and that we can grow so many things here in our state.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the peanuts and the cotton, those are going to be southern commodities. Missouri is very diverse, and depending on where you're at in the state is going to depend on what you grow.
So we're talking about how important it is to be located at a specific place, and this house was here in the Jeff City area. Jeff City is obviously known for being the capital of our state, but also we have the Missouri River that runs right through Jeff City or just north of it. Can you kind of talk about how integral the river system was to where people settled and how that affected them?
Yeah, so the river was a water source for a lot of people, whether that be livestock, crops, their own use. That's also how they traveled. You think back to Lewis and Clark going down the Mississippi, in a canoe. So that's how they really got from place to place. Now we have cars and trains and airplanes. That was not an option back then. So they had to settle somewhere that would give them enough resources in order to survive.
So if they wanted to irrigate their fields, or if they wanted to make sure that their livestock had water, they had to settle somewhere with a river, a creek, a stream, a water source. And also if they wanted to by chance sell some of their products, they had to be to where they could ship it down the river, because even trains weren't quite as popular back then.
Absolutely.
We're in the men's bedroom of this house, and I think what's kind of interesting to me is that the men in the family and the women in the family slept separately in the home. Do we know why that was, or was that just a tradition that they had?
Yeah, I think that's just custom to the time period. There's a lot of things that we do today that are probably wouldn't have been accepted back then, or wouldn't have even been thought of back then, but we do it because it's the time period. So that's probably why that they slept in 2 different rooms, and it was also just tradition.
So mothers and daughters slept in one room, the father and the sons would sleep in the other.
Yes.
Here we have a bed. Can you kind of walk us through the bedding choices that they had at the time?
Yeah, so that's actually pretty unique. So depending on the class and where you were at in the social status, depending on what type of bedding you used. So we have down, so each of the different sections of the bed represent a different type of material. So on the far side we have down, and down is essentially just the feathers of a goose. It's represented that you were very high class. It was more expensive, so you were able to afford that. Then we have straw next. It was considered the next ranking in the social class, followed by cotton and then corn husk. So clearly the down is the most comfortable that you would have slept on compared to corn husk, but families had to use whatever they could afford at the time, and that was also a telltale of how much money they may have had or how successful they were in their area.
That's really, so now like we have memory foam mattresses and comfortable mattresses that we sleep on, and that we, kids sleep on, adults sleep on. So was children sleeping in beds like this, or were they on the floor, or do we know?
More than likely, children were not sleeping on a down mattress. They're very expensive, and that's typically reserved for your mother and father. Children may have slept on the floor. They may have had beds, not nearly as comfortable though. We don't really know with this log cabin or with that family, but it all depended again on how much money the family had and what they could afford at the time. And you can imagine sleeping on something like straw. If you go lay on a straw bale, see how comfortable that is. Can you imagine sleeping on that all night, every single night? It could not be comfortable.
Get a little itchy, I think.
A little bit.
This house has some interesting history, especially connected to the Civil War. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're actually standing in the upstairs hallway, or the upstairs part of the dog trot. And so in 1853 through 1857, General Sterling Price, he was actually governor of Missouri for that time. He was a state representative and a congressman. But during the Civil War, he was a general for the Confederate Army, and he actually stayed here in this house upstairs for a couple days where he commanded his troops from this area. He was actually planning to attack Jefferson City, but something changed his mind, and instead of attacking the capital, he went back to Booneville.
That's so interesting, especially because this house was here in Jeff City. We were 7 miles from the capital. He could have easily attacked. And so for something to change his mind, and we don't really know now in 2020 what that was. It could have been the family. It could have been a command he received. Something changed his mind. And so interesting piece of Missouri history that we have right here.
Yeah, and not only is the log cabin historical, but there's a historical figure right here too.
Very cool.